Okay, in terms of the stuff, minor change to the deadline, you might have noticed. I pushed the exam 1 deadline back to October 26, and the last 2 quizzes for part 2 back to October 26 as well. If you've already done them, you're done. If you haven't done them, they're still there. For exam 2, quizzes part 3, November 16th. Exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, December 7th. All these are end of day. Then exam 5, the exciting final, covering all the things. Deadline is December 13th at 5 p.m. if you need it. For the paper, draft deadline November 9th, plus 5 November 14th, merger deadline November 21st, and the desperation deadline December 8th. Before going on to more new stuff in part 3, epistemology and metaphysics, anything about any previous stuff? Stuff to be neat stuff.
Well, I have a question about the sample questions, the sample exam questions. How do we know like what we got wrong or right? Cause I noticed it just gave a check mark in the paper.
Oh, it doesn't give you, you can't go and look at it? I'll check that. They should be able to go in, and I thought I had said so you could see like your answers and responses, but it might not have transferred over. Send me an email, remind me to do that, and I'll go in and change the settings, so hopefully you can go back and look at stuff.
Okay.
It's supposed to allow you to do that, but it used to, but then all the settings didn't come over when I told you.
Okay.
Get anything else? Okay, so now we begin with part 3. And we'll start with epistemology, but as we'll see, it kind of swishes or blends into metaphysics, so there'll be some contamination. As we saw back in the ancient days of the start of the semester, epistemology is the science or study of knowledge, stuff you know or don't know. And there's all kinds of classic problems and questions. Again, the kind of the big problem that gets used in a lot of movies is, of course, a problem of the external world. How do we know that what we're experiencing is really real for real, and it's not the Matrix, or a dream like Inception, or the workings of an evil demon, or whatever. And as I know, this has become really popular in movies and television. Matrix, Inception, Black Mirror really likes to use epistemology, and so does The Good Place and Legion. So it was like, wow, they're using epistemology in popular TV shows. Who would have believed it? Second problem, of course, is the problem of other minds, which is if you assume there's real stuff, how do you know what other people are thinking, or if they're thinking at all? And of course, kind of sci-fi-ish, how would you know if other entities, non-humans, robots, etc., whether they were thinking or not? And then there's the sort of broad problem of skepticism. How do you know anything at all? And of course, the general questions are, what is knowledge? What can you know? What are the limits of knowledge? And all questions involving knowing stuff. And there are some very practical applications. Again, when we try to figure out what other people are thinking, if they're telling us the truth or not, we're doing a very practical epistemology. Gathering intelligence, say like at the military level, like one question is, have the Russians been building medium-range nuclear weapons? Trump says yeah, some experts say yeah, the Russians say no, and that's a question of epistemology. How do you know if they're really doing that or not? Also, courtrooms, the weighing of evidence, etc., practical epistemology. So a pretty broad field, ranging from everything from how do we know the real world is really real for real, to questions of evidence and investigations. Now, throughout history, epistemology is split into 2 broad camps, which fight and dispute, and they've been around since the start of philosophy and persist to this day. First camp are the rationalists. They are people like our good dear friend Descartes, also Plato, our good dear friend Dr. Leibniz, Hansen, etc. And we saw a bit about this before, talking about arguments about God. And the rationalists believe that we can know things about the world a priori. prior to experience. So by pure reasoning, just by thinking about stuff or starting the definition, you can conclude that things exist. You know, one example we already saw was St. Anselm's ontological argument, which is an a priori argument for God. Rationalists also accept the idea of innate ideas. And I used the metaphor before of a computer. Back in the old days of computing, back in the 1980s and early 90s, you can get a computer like a Commodore 64 or VIC-20 or Trash 80 or something, and when you turned it on, the cursor just flicked. There's no software in there. So if you wanted to do anything, you'd have to load a program or program it yourself. Now, today, of course, if you get a laptop, smartphone, tablet, etc., it's got an operating system, all kinds of stuff in there. It's pre-stocked with programs. And metaphorically, those are like innate ideas, things that are built in, like in the factory, that you don't have to install. Now, rationalists disagree a great deal about how these work, what they are, how you get them. Some, like Descartes, say it's God writing upon your soul. And one of the things he puts in there is, you know, the idea of himself, you know, like the signature like God, made by God. Other people could be total atheists, but still believe in innate ideas. One common example is human notions of, say, beauty, or things we find disgusting or frightening. So, for example, do we have to learn to dislike and be afraid of spiders, or do they just sort of, or do we have like an innate revulsion of them, where we just find them, you know, for the most part, pretty creepy? And some people argue that, you know, our notion of beauty and our notion of certain instinctive fears are hardwired into us. So they're not put there by God, they're put there by evolution and biology. So you can believe in God, believe in innate ideas, you can atheist, believe in innate ideas. They've got equal opportunity.
So you're saying the atheists will argue like, I guess they know about that, they just don't think.
Oh, yeah, because in the case of God, there is a book called The God Gene, where there's been an argument that humans are pre-genetically disposed to believe in supernatural stuff. And so we do have like an innate God gene, not because God put it in there, but we just have this, you know, wiring thing. And for those who believe in evolution, the idea would be that it's supposed to be beneficial, or at least it hasn't killed us yet. And so it'd be, you know, baked in there in our genes. And it's an interesting scientific question about how much stuff is actually built in there, you know, what we're hardwired for, and what we have to pick up in the environment. The second big camp are, of course, our friends, the empiricists. From this we get empirical science, empirical investigation, etc. And the idea is that whatever you know about the world has to be a posteriori, after experience. And they generally take the view that whatever you know about what's out there comes from out there through the senses. Now again, they do allow for the use of, you know, scientific instruments. So it doesn't have to be that you have to like look at it directly or see it or hear it. You could use telescopes, MRI machines, etc. And you can do some indirect inferences. So for example, we've never actually looked at an electron because they're super small, but we can empirically infer their existence by their effects. But the empiricists say, whatever you know about the world has to come down to something empirical, something observable. You just can't sit down and know stuff about the world by thinking about it. Now, both camps do agree that you can know some stuff just by pure reason. So if you ask the empiricist, how many sides is the triangle I drew, how many does it have, they would say 3. They don't think you have to like look to see if triangles have 3 sides. And if you ask the empiricist, how many bachelors are married, they would just say none, because that's by definition. And so both camps would agree you can know some things a priori, but the big dispute is, what can you know about the world? And rationalists say you could know about stuff, like God's existence. And empiricists say, no, you can only know things like mathematics and logic and definitions, but you can't know if stuff exists without looking. They also reject innate ideas. And the phrase used by our good friend John Locke the term tabula rasa, or blank slate, or if you want to be more contemporary, empty hard drive. And so the idea is whereas the rationalists believe you're pre-stocked with knowledge, the metaphor through empiricists would be like that old computer where you turn it on and it's just blinking. There's no programs in there, you have to load stuff in. And so the empiricists believe whatever you know has to come in through the senses, and that's how it gets loaded into your mind. Otherwise, the content is emptiness. Now, going way back to our good dead friend Plato, kind of the standard model of knowledge was this. You know something means you have what's called, it's the JTB model, justified true belief. Now, everyone agrees that if you know something, it's got to be true. I mean, yeah, you can know that something's like false, but in general, to know something means that it's got to be true. If it's false, you don't know it, you're wrong. Also, of course, knowledge is a state of mind, whatever the mind is, and so you have to believe it. And so at the very least, it's something you believe and it's true. And then the debate is, what more than that is it? And going back to our good dead friend Plato, the idea was it had to be justified. There had to be something more than you believe it and you're right, because you could believe something just by luck. It has to have this justification. And so the battle in epistemology for a long time was over this. If you claim that something you believe is true and you want to claim you know it, in the strict sense, what kind of thing do you have to present in terms of justification to establish it, to say, yeah, I definitely know that. And people, as you might imagine, disagree quite a bit. For example, we'll look at our good dead friend Descartes, and he says, to be justified, to know it, you either have to see its truth just through this rational intuition, or get it through deductive logic from using a valid argument and true premises. So super strict. Now in the 1970s, a fellow named Gettier came along, and with a short article and a couple of weird examples involving some coins in a car and someone being in Barcelona, managed to blow up the whole JTB thing. So it's been broken ever since. But that's life. Everything gets broken. Now, epistemology and metaphysics really got rolling along with philosophy in general with our good dead friend Plato. As we saw, we looked at the idea of Thales starting a philosophy. There was stuff done before Plato, before Socrates. In fact, there's a whole school of philosophers known as the Pre-Socratics, which include a bunch of really dead people. And they did a lot of stuff, but of course Plato is the best known of the Western Greek philosophers. And we saw his Apology before, and when Plato is doing his Platoing, usually it's Socrates saying the Plato stuff, although not always. Now, Plato's mission and objective is to define knowledge. So when can we say that we know something? Now, in the informal use of the term know, we just mean we believe it. Someone says, yeah, I know that. They probably don't mean that they've achieved, this level of epistemic knowledge. They just mean, yeah, I believe it, or yeah, that's what I think. And so there's the common use of the term know, which can be wrong. People can say, yeah, I know I left my keys there. And they're like, well, I guess I was wrong. I guess I didn't know. So what are Plato's main opponents? Well, for him, there are three. Kind of the intuitive, common sense view of knowledge is that you believe it and you're right. And it's kind of a common sense view. You believe something and you're right about it. So Plato wants to argue against that. He wants to argue that knowledge is not just believing it and being right. There's got to be something more. He also wants to argue against relativism. as you saw back in the ancient days of the first part, one of the main enemies of Socrates were the sophists, and they embraced relativism. And relativism is a view that truth is, well, relative. That there's not an objective truth, that it depends on, typically like the culture for cultural relativism. And Plato wants to reject that. Because if relativism were true, then the world would not be safe for knowledge, at least the type he wants. Because it could be like, something could be true and also false. So how does he beat up on relativism? Well, he does accept that some things are relative. Obvious example would be temperature. If you're from Maine, like me, Florida is a very hot state, and this weather is finally livable, But if you're from, say Puerto Rico or the Caribbean, or South Florida, then Tallahassee feels cool, and this weather is now cold. And so there's objective temperature, like how many degrees it is, but whether it feels warm or cold to you is relative. And so Plato doesn't dispute that, because there are some things that are clearly relative. So his two arguments against relativism, we've seen these before. One is clever in general, and the other is a very particular one. The general one is that it's self-defeating, as we saw back in the start of the semester, which is if relativism is true, if everything is true, then the claim that relativism is false is true. So then relativism, if it's true, it's false, and of course if it's false, it's false. Either way, it's false, which is either brilliant or trickery, or brilliant trickery. But he's satisfied with it. He says, yep, I'm done with that. Now he also does a personal attack against Protagoras, who is a sophist, and Protagoras and the other sophists charge for their teachings. And so Socrates said, if someone's a relativist and says, there's no objective truth, yet they charge people for offering them something better, that's a bit of a problem, because if there's no better or worse truth, then why pay someone to teach you things when your opinion is just as good as theirs? So, and it's even not really like a matter of convenience. Like, with cooking, it makes sense. If someone can only cook as well as you, if you don't want to spend the time, then sure, paying them would be okay. But, if you're trying to learn stuff, then paying someone who knows no more than you, that would be terribly useful. Like, imagine paying someone to teach you something and they just tell you things you already know. Like, Tallahassee's in Florida. Money well spent. So he thinks at this point he's defeated relativism. So that, as far as he's concerned, it's done. Now, of course, just because he said so and he's Plato and he's dead, doesn't mean he's right. Maybe he didn't beat relativism. And of course, the relativists, they didn't accept their defeat, because relativism is still a thing today. Now, a second main enemy is empiricism. Namely, the idea that what you comes through the senses. So Plato is going to be a rationalist in that he thinks whatever you know doesn't come through the senses. Now, he doesn't say the senses are, useless, etc. But his claim is that whatever you know, you don't know through your senses. And again, he's using the strict term of knowledge, not like the everyday kind of term. In everyday, I'd say, yeah, I know my backpack's there, or I know, I'm in this room. But in the strict sense, I don't really know, because I can't be certain that this is not just, a computer simulation, or that I'm hallucinating or something after drinking some bad Gatorade. Or a really good Gatorade, depending how you look at it. So what's the first problem? Well, the first problem for him is this. He points out correctly that the world of the senses constantly changes. So we can't be certain. The best we can do is say how something appears to us at a particular time. That it seems to be this at this time. But of course, he claims we can't get beyond that. We can't say beyond appearances, and of course, if time passes, we can't be certain. Here's my usual example. If you have a vehicle, when you left it, after parking it, was it on fire? No, you probably wouldn't have left it, or maybe you would have, very quickly. Is it on fire now? You don't know, because unless you get an app, your phone, your car calls you on fire. Yeah, you don't know, maybe it is. Hopefully not, probably not. But we don't know. And so because the world of senses is constantly changing, we can never be sure. And of course, even when we're looking at stuff, we still can't be sure because we're just looking at things. We can't be sure they really are what we think they are. And then, as we'll see when we talk about the skeptics also took this view, saying that when you're looking at stuff, maybe you're hallucinating, maybe the light's off, maybe it's an intentional deception.
So even with like the triangle having 3 sides, they're saying you might be looking at it wrong, or
if you try to do empirically, now Plato would say, yeah, you could know the triangle thing. You could know triangles have 3 sides, but you wouldn't know that through your senses. He said you have to learn that somewhere else, or so he claims. Again, just because he was Plato and really dead doesn't mean he's automatically right. So because of this, he claims, because of the uncertainty in appearance, we can't take the senses to be a source of knowledge. So now critics, Aristotle, for example, disagree with him. Aristotle said, even if things do change and all you get is appearance, you can still know stuff. You can know that, it looked like my car wasn't on fire when I left. So you can know that didn't seem to be on fire 20 minutes ago. So what their battle is over, kind of like what would count as knowledge. For Plato, his bias, as you'll see, is for it's got to always be true and unchanging. But even his student Aristotle rejected that. He allowed you could know stuff, even though it may change and you may be wrong now. If you are careful and say that it didn't look like my car was on fire when I left, you could know that. Second problem. Definitions. Socrates, as say Plato in this case, was really concerned about definitions, really big on defining things to create these categories. So his claim is that to have knowledge, you've got to have unchanging definitions. And his reasoning is, if you didn't have unchanging definitions, language would not work. It would shift. Therefore, you can't rely on the senses to define stuff for you, because otherwise you wouldn't have, language would stop working, you would never work, you wouldn't have knowledge. Now again, critics have said, well, yeah, if definitions like change constantly with no warning, imagine we all have like word randomizers, in our brain, and so our words, the meaning change constantly. Well, yeah, then we couldn't communicate. But you could make the argument that, yeah, you need definitions to be kind of stable, but they don't have to be unchanging. And as a matter of practical fact, of course, definitions do change. If you go and, think of slang terms, even in your own lifetime, like how terms have changed, words have become either gotten slang meanings or lost their slang meanings. And if you go and look at dictionaries, they'll typically have a thing where they say like how something is like archaic, once meant this, not used that much anymore, or they'll talk about like, rarely used or something. And so it does seem that your definitions need to be kind of stable, but they don't have to be unchanging. So critics could argue against Plato. Now probably his most interesting argument, and kind of very relevant today, is the perfect standard argument, which takes us to triangles. Now, Plato noticed what eventually everyone notices, namely the physical world is imperfect. No matter how beautiful a person is, they're still not perfectly beautiful. They have some flaw. If you try to deal with things like, to go with the triangles, like geometric shapes, if you try to draw like a perfect circle, it's not gonna be perfect. I mean, you try to freehand it, it's gonna obviously be, because circles don't have tails, be kind of defective. And even if you like laser print it, on a PostScript, 800 DPI laser printer, it's still, if you looked at it with a magnifying glass or a microscope, you'd see all kinds of jaggies and defects. And so Plato is right. If we think of things like perfect justice, perfect beauty, perfect circle, perfect triangle, then we realize that the world falls short. But, he reasons, we have notions of this. We realize that no particular person is perfectly beautiful, but we have, to make that judgment, we've got to have a standard of perfect beauty. And since we don't get it here, he claims we must get it somewhere. Almost forgot. Now, one area where this becomes particularly relevant and interesting today is this. Back in the day, even fairly recently, you can get by measuring things kind of roughly. For example, if you're making like a table, you don't have to worry about getting it like to the micron level, because you got to be kind of close. Like you don't want one leg like an inch longer than the other, but if it's like a tiny bit, like a millimeter bigger, not really going to notice that. But nowadays, of course, because of our technology, we need incredibly precise measures, exacting measures. And we're running into the limits of the physical world. For example, take the problem of measuring distance. One problem is, of course, measuring distances. And if you're measuring something, you wonder, is my measurement correct? You've got to know if your, say, yardstick or meter stick is correct. So how do you know? Well, you got to get something else to measure it. And if that's defective, then your measurements are going to be off. Now, what they used to have a literal meter bar, which is stored in a noble gas, non-reactive gas, and they would use that. That's a standard by which every meter would be judged. Now, of course, most meter sticks, if you have like a wooden meter stick, it's going to be a little off. Like, if you ever drop it, it'll condense the wood. If it's cooler or warmer, it'll expand a bit. But generally, for what we're doing, not the big of a deal. But when you're doing things like, for example, some of the engines on jets, they're engineered at tolerance levels that are like micrometers, just tiny, microscopic distances. Especially, and if you think of like computers, the CPUs, those are done on the nanoscale. And so if you're off by a tiny bit, that can mess stuff up. For example, there was a jet that crashed because of this. The engine, are manufactured to incredible precision. Because we can do that, because why not? The only problem is, though, if you're off even by, the more precise your machinery is, the more errors are problematic. Like, for example, old cars, old vehicles, those things, like the old kind of crude engines, they weren't super great engines, but they would run really through almost anything because they're so badly made in a way, so they can just rattle around and stuff. But when you have an engine that's incredibly precise, a tiny microscopic error means the difference between the engine working fine and melting itself, which was what happened. And it wasn't like a big mistake. It was just less than a millimeter. Just you wouldn't even be able to notice it and see it. And so we're running into this problem of the physical world is too imprecise for what we're trying to do. So now what they've started doing is using waves of light to define the length of a meter. And that's not even good enough, because it's still imperfect. So Plato made a point, long ago, where we're running into the practical implications. Namely that the physical world is imperfect, and it's not precise enough for what we want to do. Which can mean two things. One is, we're going to hit the limits of matter. We just can't make things any better because of imperfection. And the other possibility, kind of sci-fi, is that we transcend the limits of matter and start making, really strange they'll probably kill us all eventually. Because in science fiction, you know, whenever they're exploring new dimensions and boundaries, that always ends badly. But what's the worst that could happen? So, perfect standard argument says physical things fall short. We do have knowledge of perfect things because we realize this. Therefore, what we know can't come from the senses, because we can't get a standard for perfect beauty, perfect justice, perfect meter from observing things in the physical world, because they're all imperfect. So wherever we get this from, this knowledge from, it can't be through the senses. So at this point, to his satisfaction, he thinks the senses as a source of knowledge, they're done. So whatever you don't know through your senses. Which raises the question, so where do we know it from? Now again, just because Plato was Plato and smart and dead, doesn't mean he went uncontested. Obviously enough, the empiricists, there are a lot of philosophers living and many more dead that are empiricists, or were, they're dead, and they disagree with this. So there are counters to this. So to his satisfaction, he's beat relativism, beat empiricism. So what he has left is this: the idea that if you know something, you're merely got right opinion. You believe it and it's true. And he thinks this isn't enough. Why? Well, his reasoning is simply being right and believing it doesn't prove that a person knows it, because they could just be lucky or guessing. For example, not Plato's argument, but he uses this following, like an illustration. On a math test, is there a chance a person could just guess the right number? Oh, there is. I've done that, did that in high school. Guessing. Got me that D I needed to grab, get that class done. Yeah, so you could guess, and there's a non-zero chance you'll get it right. Odds are pretty low, but you could do it by guessing. Or a person may have a weird system of doing it. They may look out the window and see two birds fly by and say, the answer is 2. And they happen to be right. And they really believe it. But we don't think that looking at signs from birds or squirrels would be a good way to do math. And so Plato's view is you got to be able to provide an account, a justification for the belief. And so he concludes that merely being right and believing it's not enough. What's needed is an account. Otherwise, it's not, doesn't count as knowledge. Because a person could be just right and believe it, but if they can't give a reason why, he claims they don't have knowledge. Now this goes on to be debated quite a bit, because there are those who claim that, if you get it right and you believe it, then you know, if you can't give the reasons for it. And so if you take the class in epistemology, you'll see that battle. Because there are some people who claim, as long as you have a way of getting things right and it works reliably, it doesn't matter if you can give any real justification or not. And other people say, you got to be able to justify. So it's kind of the question of, in order to know, do you have to know you know, or do you just have to know? And some people's, their intuition is, if you know, it's not enough to just know, you got to know you know in order to know. And then people say, well, then do you have to know that you know that you know that you know, and that gets a little crazy. So to Plato's satisfaction, he has crushed the relativist, he has defeated the empiricist, and he has shown that knowledge is more than just right opinion. It's right opinion plus justification. So then, if you can't get the knowledge from the senses, from here, where do you get it? Well, Plato says, and these are the conditions for knowledge. It's got to be objective, because again, he's attacked relativism, so the opposite of it, it's got to be objective. It can't come from the senses, because according to him, he's attacked those. It can't be, subjective, it's got to be universal. It can't change, because the arguments for the senses, it's going to be changeless. And since it can't come from the senses, that only leaves us one other option, at least if it's reason or senses, it's got to be reason. So as he sees it, whatever it is that we know has got to meet those conditions, which what he comes up with are the famous Platonic forms, which is sometimes translated kind of badly as ideas. And ideas is kind of a bad choice because even though it was pretty popular, because ideas makes it sound like it's just in your head. But Plato's forms, they're not in your mind, they're not really anywhere, as we'll see. So, what are these forms? Well, as Plato sees it, and others see it, reality consists of two types of categorizations. There are particulars, which are sometimes called tokens. Those are individuals. So, for example, each of us would be a particular human. And then there are categories, which are types. And every token belongs to one or more types. Or put another way, every individual thing belongs to one or more types. So, like this individual marker belongs to the category marker. It also belongs to other categories too, like objects and stuff in the room, etc. Now, in addition to being called the forms, they later get kind of generalized by people who do metaphysics to be known as universals. And the idea is that these universals or forms are the categories. So, what qualities do they have? Well, they're super weird. First, since they can't, they perish, and you really couldn't know them according to Plato, they are eternal. So they're timeless. They're not created, and they never end. Also, they never change, ever. Because if they change, then we couldn't know them. They're also perfect. And so for Plato, for every type, like human, beauty, justice, etc., there would be a universal, or form, if you prefer, that is eternal, changeless, and perfect. Perfect justice, perfect beauty, at least according to him. Now, again, he's driven to this by his view of like what knowledge is. So if knowing requires these qualities, there's going to be someone that has those qualities, and these are the forms. So how do they connect to us here? So I said, like all humans are somehow connected to the form human. All beautiful things are connected to beauty. Well, Plato has a metaphor, which he calls participation, sometimes translated as imitation. And the idea is that somehow every individual, say human, we participate in the form human. So in virtue of what is each of us human, Plato would say, well, he was dead, he would say because we participate in the form human. If something is beautiful, it is beautiful because it participates in or imitates the form of beauty. Now, since the forms are not here, the people, when they talk about where they are, they refer to it as a Platonic heaven. Now, in a way, that's kind of a potentially a bad choice, because we think of heaven as being religious and God and angels and stuff, and Plato's heaven doesn't have any of that stuff. It's just the forms. And so the question is, how, if they're outside of space and time, how is it we know about it? And here's his answer, which is kind of creepy. You know about them, you learn about them when you're dead. Here's how. Now, one of the dialogues called the Meno, named after Meno presents to Socrates, does say Plato, a paradox, which is this. The paradox essentially is you can never know anything. It's a circular regress, because if you don't know, you'll never know when you've got knowledge. You never know when you know it, because you don't know what it is. And to use an analogy, suppose you're looking for a, glove. If you have no idea what it is, you could have one right now and not know it. So you'll never know when you find it. And of course, if you have knowledge, you don't have to find it because you've already got it. And so his paradox is that you can never learn because if you don't know, you can never know. And if you do know, you don't need to know. It's a circular regress, kind of like the job experience thing. So how does he fix it? Well, pretty extreme fix. Plato, Socrates, claims that what happens is this. When you die, your soul is immortal, and it goes and hangs out with the forms. So in a way, it's kind of like heaven in that regard, because even though for Plato there's no God or angels, there'd be lots of dead people there, lots of souls. And they commune with the forms, however that works. And what happens is, according to Plato, when you're reborn, and in the Republic, you were born, you spend 1,000 years dead, and then you're reborn, and then 1,000 years dead, then you're reborn. What happens is, like when you're reborn, you forget all that stuff. Not completely, though. Because according to Plato, what happens is this. And I'll use a modern analogy. Now, if you have a computer, or you can also like your smartphone or tablet, and you erase stuff on it to make room. Say like your phone's filling up and you start deleting apps. Now, or on your computer, if you start deleting files, they're not really gone until they've been overwritten. So if on your computer, if say like you're getting rid of your computer and you drag all your files in the trash, and empty the trash and give it to someone else, the files really aren't gone. And someone could pretty easily just recover them. It's actually, there's lots of programs that do, free programs that do it, and just go and recover stuff. And of course it's legitimate use, because sometimes, if you put stuff in the trash and delete it, you're like, crap, I put my important stuff in there. But there are people who go around collecting old hard drives and try to get financial information and other stuff off them. And until you actually write over that stuff, it's still there. In a way, what you're doing, to use a filing cabinet analogy, it's like you have a filing cabinet at work, and instead of someone like clearing out the old files, they just put a sticker on it, feel free to throw this away if you need more room. But until you actually go in and clear it out, that stuff's still there. And so with the metaphor, in a way, what kind of happens is that when we're born, it's like our hard drive gets like whacked and our directory is gone. So all the files are in there, we just can't see them. And back when computers, in the early days of computing, common problem. I remember when I was working my dissertation, Apple System 7 had a bug which made all your files vanish. Made all my whole dissertation vanish. That was awesome. Fortunately, I printed up a copy because I was paranoid, and also made all the copies whenever I put a floppy disk in my backup, erased that too. So it was a very thorough bug. Unfortunately, I had my one printed copy, and I spent the whole weekend retyping everything. Good times. Because they had scanners back then, but they were like, I don't know, $10,000 or something. So now they're like, $50. And so your hard drive metaphorically gets, gets bumped, and all the files are still in there, but you don't have the directory. So when you go to like double click on your mind, nothing, empty folders. But what Socrates says is, through philosophy, the doctrine of recollection, you can be led to remember stuff. So if you're asked the right questions, it's like one of those the programs used to restore lost files. It like repairs your directory, so you start remembering stuff from when you were dead. Now to prove this, at least to his satisfaction, Socrates walks one of Meno's servants through a geometric proof, going through each step. And his argument is this. Meno claims that a servant never learned geometry in this life. Yet Socrates, by asking questions, is able to get him to go through this geometric proof. And so he concludes the servant knows geometry even though he never learned it here. And what Socrates is doing is merely recovering these memories of geometry. And so he considers that to be proof that people learn when they're dead. Because if the servant didn't learn geometry, in their lifetime, they must have learned it, according to Socrates, before they were born this time. Now, naturally, there's been a lot of criticism of that, because the most obvious one being that Socrates, by asking the questions, is leaving the servant along and providing them with the information they need. So it's not like the servant just sat down, Socrates asked a couple questions, he's like whipping off, higher order, differential equations and geometric proofs. It's that he keeps asking questions and guiding them through it. And you can make the argument that even the person who didn't know geometry at all, Socrates could still walk him through guide him through that. But his claim is, you hang with the forms and you're dead, you're reborn, you forget about it, and then when you do philosophy, you relearn it. Now if you're wondering, hey, is there any really useful stuff in there? Things like winning lottery numbers, or who's going to win the World Series, or presidential elections, or which horses are going to win the races. Unfortunately, no. Nothing about the world is in there. It's all stuff about the forms. So it's things like justice, geometry, mathematics, beauty. None of the stuff like winning lottery numbers, unfortunately. If it were, I guess that'd be pretty handy if we wanted to recollect that pretty quickly. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the stuff for today. Next time, on to is metaphysics.